In the news tonight, the lower house of parliament passes the 2013 temporary budget law with 68 deputies of the 86 present in the session voting in favor. Global leaders call for peace talks to be held as soon as possible to resolve the Syrian civil war, but fail to mention the fate of President Bashar al-Assad. And Boeing launches a larger version of its flagship Dreamliner aircraft, sharpening the battle with rival Airbus in the booming market for fuel-efficient long-distance jets. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Here are the details. His Majesty the King holds talks in London tomorrow with British Prime Minister David Cameron and Foreign Secretary William Hague. His Majesty left today on a working visit to the UK, during which he will also meet with parliamentary committees and will address the British Royal College for Defence Studies. His Royal Highness Prince Faisal bin Al Hussein was sworn in as regent during the King's absence. The lower house passed the 2013 state budget and approved the budget of independent governmental agencies as well as the annex to the 2012 state budget law. Deputies voted on the state budget temporary law following a long debate in which they called for effective measures to control public spending and find sustainable solutions to poverty and unemployment. Here's more.
68 deputies of the 86 present in the session voted in favor of the temporary budget law. The budget projects an estimated 1,309 million dinars deficit and 6,146 million dinars in revenues, including 5,296 million in domestic revenues and 850 million in foreign grants. It sets public expenditures at 7,455 million dinars, including some 6,210 million in current expenditures, while capital expenditures are estimated at 1,245 of public spending. Commenting on remarks by lawmakers made during the debate, Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour said there will be no raise in electricity prices for households this year, while next year, he pointed, bills exceeding 50 dinars per month will be subject to a 15% price increase. Mansour had told the House that this year's budget is the first in the kingdom's history with current spending cuts, while capital expenditure is raised to create job-generating projects. Mansour also said Jordan's internal and external debt amounted to 17 billion dinars and vowed the government would take all necessary measures to offset this deficit. Zain Abu Sufa for the news at 10.
The Senate has called on the kingdom's relevant bodies and institutions to lay down plans, policies and legislation necessary to implement national priorities that His Majesty the King listed in his landmark address to the nation on Sunday. In a statement, the Senate voiced support of the King's views that law must prevail and nobody is above the law, and commitment to the roadmap of reforms as set out by His Majesty. The Senate called on all Jordanians to show understanding, cooperation and support during this critical phase that Jordan is passing through. As part of Eager Lion Exercise 2013, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mish'ar al-Zeben in the company of U.S. Secretary of the Army John McHugh attended a joint Jordanian-U.S. training exercise. Exercise Eager Lion is part of a long history of multilateral military exercises in Jordan, which strives to strengthen military-to-military relationships of participating partner nations through a joint whole-of-government multinational approach. 8,000 personnel from 19 countries will take part in a Jordanian-led exercise tomorrow, focusing on aspects such as integrated air and missile defense, as well as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief to address current and future conflict security issues. Over to the crisis in Syria and the growing refugee issue. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, said massive support is needed to help countries cope with the number of Syrian refugees fleeing violence in their country. Guterres was speaking during a visit to Lebanon, where Lebanese officials say the total number of Syrians, including registered and non-registered refugees, is as high as 1 million people.
I have no doubt that the Syrian crisis is not only one of the most dramatic humanitarian crises that we have faced since the Cold War, but it is the most dangerous one. And the risks of spillover and the risks of negative impact on the countries of the region are enormous. And I believe massive support is required.
The crisis in Syria has dominated the meeting of G8 leaders in Northern Ireland and was the focus of the final communiqué. Global leaders called for peace talks to be held as soon as possible to resolve the Syrian civil war, but they failed to mention the fate of President Bashar al-Assad in the summit communiqué. We remain committed to achieving a political solution to the crisis, stated the final communiqué, based on a vision for a united, inclusive and democratic Syria. The G8 leaders also called on the Syrian authorities and the opposition to commit to destroying all organizations affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Russian President Vladimir Putin had clashed with other leaders over the conflict and resisted their attempts to get him to agree to anything that would imply Assad should step down or that Russia should tone down its support for al-Assad. Putin told the meeting that sending weapons to Syrian rebels could one day backlash in Europe and end up there, but defended Russia's own military contracts with the Syrian government, saying his country's arms supplies to Syria are legal and do not violate moral principles. He also renewed his criticism of U.S. plans to send weapons to Syrian rebels and said that some G8 leaders have also expressed doubt that forces loyal to al-Assad had used chemical weapons.
I would like to point out that among the opposition there are many people like that. Not all of them, of course, but there are very many criminals who would commit such brutal crimes like one in London. Do the Europeans want to supply weapons to those people? What will happen with those weapons later? Who will monitor in whose hands they will end up and where they will turn up in the end? Perhaps in Europe itself. That's why we call upon our partners to think seriously before taking this dangerous step.
U.S. President Barack Obama had said it was important to build a strong opposition in Syria that could function after Bashar Assad loses power. German Chancellor Angela Merkel told German media on the sidelines of the G8 summit, the humanitarian situation in Syria is very difficult and Germany will therefore make its largest ever aid contribution of 200 million euros. She said the amount of money shows how serious Germany views the humanitarian situation and the refugee issue, especially in Jordan.
The humanitarian situation is unbearable And that's why the G8 countries decided to considerably increase the aid with a total of more than $1 billion. Germany will make a contribution of 200 million euros. This is the largest ever contribution we paid for humanitarian aid.
Meanwhile, and in a bid to draw the politicians' attention to world hunger, campaigners dressed as G8 leaders posed for photographs at a golf course in Northern Ireland. Members of the campaign, dubbed Not Enough Hunger for Everyone If, drove around a golf course not far from the G8 summit venue, holding a flag with the words "End Hunger" written on it. They said the world's powers should be doing more to tackle poverty and taking action against tax avoidance and evasion.
During this summit, $2.2 billion left the poorest countries through tax evasion. If poor countries were able to collect all the tax that they're owed, then they would be able to end hunger 4 times over by themselves. So this is a real opportunity to enable the end of hunger by tackling the causes of hunger, fundamental to which is the crisis of tax evasion.
In Iraq, at least 29 people were killed and more than 56 injured in 2 separate attacks by suicide bombers. One suicide bomber blew himself up about 100 meters from a mosque in Qahira district in Baghdad, and minutes later the other detonated his bomb inside the building. More than 1,000 people were killed in militant attacks in Iraq in May, according to the United Nations, making it the deadliest month since 2007. Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan defended his decision to take a tough stand against demonstrators in Istanbul's Taksim Square, saying he did whatever he had to do in a state of law. He also said the unrest had cost the state more than $53 million. According to the Turkish Medical Association, the unrest has left 4 people dead overall, including 1 policeman and about 7,500 injured. Following 2 days of clashes between demonstrators and police, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urged maximum restraint and constructive dialogue in Turkey. The Greek Council of State, the country's top administrative court, has ruled against the shutdown of the state broadcaster ERT, which triggered a government crisis. The Council of State decided that ERT should remain open during the restructuring period until the creation of its leaner substitute later this summer, as Greek Prime Minister Antonis Samaras had planned. One staff member said this decision helps the 3 coalition parties avoid a dead end, gives them some more time, and works well for all of them to avoid collapse. Samaras last week ordered the closure of ERT, saying it is inefficient and full of corruption. Boeing launched a larger version of its flagship Dreamliner aircraft, sharpening the battle with rival Airbus in the booming market for fuel-efficient long-distance jets. The much-anticipated announcement came at the Paris Air Show. The 787-10 Dreamliner, worth $30 billion, is a vote of support for the lightweight carbon composite jet just months after the first version was grounded by battery problems. The buyers of the new jet are Air Lease Corp and Singapore Airlines, United Airlines, British Airways, and GE Capital Services. The third variant of the Dreamliner will have a range of 7,000 nautical miles with seating for up to 330 passengers. The first delivery is scheduled for 2018. Jordan's Al Nashama beat Oman in their final round 4 World Cup Group B Asian qualifier in a game played in Amman this evening. The sole goal came from Ahmed Hayel in the 57th minute. With today's result, Jordan is in 3rd place in the group and thus earned a berth in the playoff against Uzbekistan, the 3rd place side from Group A in September. The winner from that game will take on 5th place South American nation in November in the final hurdle on the road to Brazil. And Australia beat Iraq 1-0 to become the second country to qualify for the 2014 World Cup finals. Substitute Josh Kennedy's dramatic goal 7 minutes from time secured them the win they needed to seal second place in Asian qualifying Group B and a ticket to Brazil 2014. Iraq's hopes of qualifying were ended by last week's defeat to group winners Japan.
I'm part of this.
Iran also qualified after beating South Korea 1-0. Despite the defeat, the South Koreans also qualified for the finals after they edged Uzbekistan 5-1 for the runners-up spot on goal difference. And for a quick look at the weather, moderate conditions prevail tomorrow in most regions, yet hot in the valley and the Gulf of Aqaba with slightly high seas. Winds will be northwesterly moderate and brisk in the afternoon, blowing dust in the Badia. Here now is a look at temperatures forecast for tonight and tomorrow. And to close, here's a reminder of the day's top stories. The lower house of Parliament passes the 2013 temporary budget law with 68 deputies of the 86 present in the session voting in favour. Global leaders call for peace talks to be held as soon as possible to resolve the Syrian civil war, but failed to mention the fate of President Bashar al-Assad. And Boeing launches a larger version of its flagship Dreamliner aircraft, sharpening the battle with rival Airbus in the booming market for fuel-efficient long-distance jets. And with this, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Alia Tuqan. Thank you for joining us and have a good night.